Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and I'm glad you could join me today. If you're not already a subscriber, make sure to follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends. We have less than 3 weeks to go until the election. I mean, think about it. We've been talking about it for a while. It's finally almost here. And where are we going to see America go? What direction? We're in the final sprint for the White House, control of Congress. Stakes have never been higher. On one side, we have the Biden-Harris administration continuing to push its narrative of steady progress, even though ordinary Americans are feeling anything but secure and prosperous. And it's not like Harris has really separated herself from the Biden administration, but she does have millions of people who support her and are willing to pull the lever for a Harris administration that is the cornerstone is government dependency. On the other side, we have Donald Trump, who still has strong support of millions of Americans, despite the relentless attacks from both the media, the political elites. And in the last 2 weeks, while the movement in the polls is small, it appears the polling is shifting towards Trump. You have Vice President Harris, who had an abysmal few weeks, and I warned in August that she peaked, and it was only a matter of time before cracks in a campaign begin to emerge, and it looks like they started, and desperation has to be sinking in. It's why she agreed to do an interview with Bret Baier from Fox News. She wouldn't take that risk if she was up in the polls and they thought they were confident that she was going to win. But the polling itself is all over the map. And in all honesty, when you really dig into the polls, you can't really make heads or tails of it. And what I mean by that is the polls, both nationally and in the battleground states, have this as a one-point race constantly shifting between Harris and Trump. There are some polls that may show the gap is between 2 and 3 points, but again, they're all within the margin of error. And one day you'll see the poll come out and it'll be Harris up by 1 or 2. The next day you'll see a poll come out, it'll be Trump up by 1 or 2. And it just swings back and forth. And the reason I can't make sense of it is because if you take a deeper look, you begin to see some of the flaws. First off, Trump notoriously underperforms in the polls, and that was true in 2016, it was true in 2020, and we have to wait and see what happens in 2024. But the question is whether this underperforming in the polls will continue and he overperforms in the election, or is the polling actually accurate because people are less afraid to admit that they are supporting the former president? Then there's another issue I'm seeing with the polling. Vice President Harris is severely underperforming compared to where President Biden was in 2020 and where Hillary Clinton was in 2016. Look at these numbers according to the Real Clear Politics average. They do the aggregate of polling. So Harris in the national election, as of right now, up 1.8%. You had Biden in 2020 up 10%, and you had Clinton up 6.7%. In Wisconsin, Harris is currently polling at 0.3%. Biden had polling at this moment at 6.3%. Clinton had 6 points. In Pennsylvania, Trump is up 0.1 points. Biden up 7 points in 2020. Clinton up 9.2 points in 2016. Ohio, Trump 7.4. Biden 0.6. Clinton 1.8. Michigan, Trump 0.9, Biden 7 points, Clinton 11.4. Arizona, Trump 1 point, Biden 2.7 in 2020, and in 2016, Trump was 0.7. Nevada, Trump 0.2. Biden in 2020 was at 5.2 at this point, Clinton 1.3. North Carolina, Trump 0.5. Biden 3.2 in 2020, Clinton 3.0 in 2016. Georgia, Trump 0.5. Biden in 2020, 0.8, and in 2016, Georgia, Trump was 5.3. Florida, Trump 6.2. In 2020, Biden was 3.7, Clinton was 3.2 in 2016. So you see that Harris is nowhere even close to where Biden or Hillary Clinton was. Another problem for the Harris campaign, According to a Bloomberg an analysis of polls that focused on demographics, the former president has between 14 and 30% of the black vote share. Now, that's a widespread 14 to 30, but polls are consistently showing that the former president has anywhere between 18 and 22% of black votes. No Republican has received that share of votes from the black community since Richard Nixon, and it's obvious something is going on to see a shift like this. The last Republican to pull in this type of support from the black community was Nixon, and if Trump wins more than 13% of the black vote share, he will have received more individual black votes than Nixon did 50 years ago. When it comes to the Hispanic community, polls show Trump's support between 38 and 45%, depending on which poll you're looking at. Now, the last time a Republican won over 40% of the Hispanic vote was George W. Bush. Harris is performing with both groups. And if these numbers are true, if they're an accurate representation of these communities, I don't see how Trump loses this election. Now, that does not mean I am predicting a Trump victory by any stretch of the imagination. I am simply pointing out that the polling is not making much sense to me. And anyone that tells you they know how this race is going to play out, that they know who's going to win, they are lying to you. Any Republican that underestimates the Democrats' get-out-the-vote machine is a fool. Their get-out-the-vote drive is a well-oiled machine, and you underestimate it at your own peril. In any event, we have to ask the question, how did we get here? I mean, think about it. It truly is astonishing. You have an entire system that has been targeting the former president, from 4 felony cases brought against him, 2 civil cases brought against him. You have a weaponized bureaucracy engaging in lawfare. You have state-sponsored media that has provided Vice President Harris in a campaign with 84% positive coverage. Meanwhile, 89% of the coverage regarding the former president is negative coverage. And you look at it, it seems like with numbers like that, she should be up around 20 points against the former president. The entire apparatus is behind her. The entire elite class is behind her. All the money is behind her. And what would the former president's numbers look like if the coverage was actually more balanced and the bureaucracy wasn't totally in the tank for the vice president? So it's revealing, and it reveals something about the elitist. It illustrates that the political class and the elitists in the media are so out of touch with the real concerns of everyday people. They cannot fathom why someone like Trump continues to dominate the conversation, why so many people gravitate towards him. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, this elitist attitude, the let them eat cake attitude. We're going to talk about that when we get back from this quick break. So hang tight and we'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So I know every election cycle we say this is the most important race, that this is the most consequential election in our history. It's one that defines the future of America. It's become cliche to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. This is one of the most consequential races in American history, where no matter who wins, you have 2 very different visions of America. On one hand, you have Vice President Kamala Harris. And while Kamala Harris is actually a terrible candidate, that's why they tried to hide her for so long, while she's someone that doesn't have a single independent thought for herself, the little she has said in regard to policy has one common theme. And the theme is that the government is the solution to every problem that exists. It's a platform that empowers the government over ordinary Americans like you and I, that the government will give you money, the government will support you, the government will create more regulations to protect you, the government will be the ones that decide what you can see and say. The government, the government, the government. On the other hand, former President Trump offers a different vision. Now, it still includes government to a certain degree when we talk about the buildup of the military, when we talk about trade policies. But he is also proposing for less government by cutting regulations, by appointing Elon Musk to do a thorough review of government waste, of government programs, and cut the fat out of the government. But most importantly, the biggest difference between the two, while Vice President Harris wants to increase government dependency by handing out cash, Trump says that he wants to reduce government dependency by letting Americans keep more of their money that they earned, rather than it go into the federal coffers and be wasted on nonsense. I think it's important to point that out because you have 2 very, very different visions of the role of government within our society, and it's important that we make that distinction. And another thing is that the race does expose how out of touch the elites have become, and it's clear that our overlords have a dangerous level of detachment from the issues that actually matter to people like us. They have a detachment from inflation, immigration, crime, education, the possibility of World War III. Just look at the economic situation. The Biden-Harris administration continues to boast about low unemployment, how well the stock market's doing, and the so-called economic recovery. But what does that really mean for ordinary Americans? How come real ordinary Americans don't feel this wonderful economy? I mean, how many of you listening out there right now are struggling just keeping up with the cost of groceries, gas, mortgage, maybe paying rent? And it's because the elite class, they don't feel the pinch. They aren't worried about filling their gas tanks and putting food on the table. For them, the rising costs, they're an inconvenience. It's not like they like the rising costs, but they could absorb it. Whereas for many ordinary Americans, it's a daily struggle to try and balance things. When you look at the elites, they have the luxury of dismissing inflation because to them, it's just another statistic in an economic report. And according to these people, you're not supposed to believe what's in your wallet. You're not supposed to believe what's in your checking account. You're not supposed to look at the balance that you owe on your credit cards. You're not supposed to believe that you juggling and deciding which bills you could afford to pay, which ones you can't. Well, that doesn't reflect the real economy because Bidenomics is working perfectly according to them. And don't worry, because even though Bidenomics is wreaking havoc on household budgets, if Vice President Kamala Harris is elected, she's going to create an opportunity economy, right? She keeps on saying this opportunity economy. It's one of those things she remembers, just like she's from a middle-class family. And she's going to create this opportunity economy by handing out cash. Give $25,000 for down payment for first-time home buyers, $6,000 for having a child in the first year, $50,000 to start a small business. And if that won't ever goes through, I'll tell you right now, next year I'm opening like 100 small businesses. That's for sure. But if you look at what they're proposing, it's not going to help you pay down your credit card debt. It's not going to help you pay that credit card, the automobile loan that you have, pay your electric bill. And that's the problem. Again, they're out of touch. They don't realize that the whole thing is bring the cost of goods down. Now, when she talks about handing out cash, someone needs to remind me how we got the inflation mess in the first place. And when you actually examine it, it's because our government recklessly printed money and handed out cash. And her opportunity economy will do much of the same. And let's not forget crime. I mean, it's not just about the economy. We see major cities experience crime waves. And our political elites, they continue to downplay and ignore the problem. The impacts that we're seeing, particularly in our urban centers, but it's now bleeding out into suburban communities. They say, look, the FBI crime statistics are out, and they say crime is down. That the decline of our cities, that's just a right-wing talking point. It's right-wing extremists pushing that. It's a figment of our imagination. These are the same people that live in gated communities. These are the same people that are far removed from the communities that are affected by crime. These are the same people that have their own private security. And they're far removed from the senseless violence and instability that's plaguing urban areas. I mean, when was the last time you saw a politician have to step over homeless people in order to get their children on a school bus? When was the last time a politician went to a CVS where everything is locked up and it takes 30 to 45 minutes just to get a clerk who works there to grab you a tube of toothpaste? How many of these elites are willing to walk down the city streets at 11 o'clock at night in certain neighborhoods? Not in their neighborhoods, but in the neighborhoods they claim that the crime is dropping. Maybe we should do that. Maybe we should force them, if they say that crime has dropped, force them to walk the streets in some of these communities where we are seeing high levels of crime, force them to walk there at night. You see how they'll cower like little babies. They'll just roll up into the fetal position. See, the elites are more concerned with defunding the police, pushing social justice narratives, because they're the virtue signalers. They need to pat themselves on the back. And they have little regard for the person who's just trying to survive in this environment, in the environment of rising crime. And they're lying. When they say that FBI crime statistics are showing that crime is down, what they are not telling you is that the number of cities no longer reporting crime stats to the FBI has increased dramatically. And many cities, even if they do report crimes to the FBI, they're only partially reporting their numbers. And then you have to look at how many cities don't even consider theft a crime until it crosses over a threshold of like $1,000. How many district attorneys in these cities are just dropping charges right and left against violent criminal offenders? So if you really dig deeper, you'll see that crime has not decreased, actually. And we can't talk about the presidential race without mentioning the disaster that's our public education system. The elites, they praise the virtues of a public education system that they themselves would never subject their children to. They wouldn't dare put their children in some of these public schools. Public schools are failing, especially when it comes to the lower income communities. You have resources that are scarce, standards have plummeted, they simply cycle everyone through, but guess what? These elites, they don't care because they're not sending their children to these schools. Their children attend elite private institutions, or they live in affluent neighborhoods where the public schools are actually functioning fairly well. They don't have any skin in the game, yet they want to dictate the policies that affects millions of families. They want to dictate what your children should be learning. Now, as we head toward Election Day, we have to remember, we have to understand that this election is not just a choice between two candidates, it's a choice between two Americas. One is the America that everyday people like you and I live in, an America where inflation, crime, illegal immigration, failing education systems are very real problems. The other is the America that the elites live in, a bubble of privilege and power insulated from the consequences of their policies, of the policies that they champion. And what we're witnessing is a cultural and political divide that has been years in the making, long before the rise of Donald Trump. We could go back 30 years. The elites believe they know what's best for you. They know what's best for me. They know what's best for our families, yet they have no idea what our lives are actually like. And I want you to stay with me because in the next segment, I'm going to play a sound clip about how out of touch these people really are. And I want to talk about the Biden's open border policies. You won't believe how the elites, once again, show just how little they care about the struggles of everyday Americans. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So let's zoom in on an issue that perfectly encapsulates the disconnect between the elites and most normal people like us. And I want to focus on illegal immigration and its real-world consequences. Over the past several months, we've seen reports emerging from Aurora, Colorado about Venezuelan gang members taking over apartment complexes. This is not sensationalism. This is actually real. These are real reports from residents who are living in fear, from residents from these communities, and even from local law enforcement, no matter how much the local law enforcement agencies want to downplay it. Now, imagine for a second that you live in one of the apartment complexes, and you have to wake up every day and have to live in fear. And this is what it's like, not just in places like Aurora, Colorado, but this is what it's like in places throughout major cities in the United States. And you have no idea when violence is going to spill over into your home or your apartment complex. And yet when the media covers these incidents, they downplay them or they just completely ignore it. And the question is why? The reason is because it doesn't fit their narrative. And more importantly, it doesn't affect the elites in their comfortable gated communities. They don't have to fear that their neighborhoods are going to be taken over by violent gangs, whether they're American gangs or foreign gangs. They don't worry about that. However, the open border policies of the Biden-Harris administration have real consequences for real Americans and legal permanent residents, and it shows us how dangerous these consequences can be. Now, on Sunday, ABC's Martha Raddatz interviewed vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance, and in that interview, she criticized Donald Trump and his campaign for supposedly demonizing illegal immigrants by pointing out what's happening in Aurora, Colorado. But here's where the elitism comes in. I want you to take a listen to Raddatz and the question that she asked the senator. Take a listen.
The incidents were limited to a handful of apartment complexes, and the mayor said our dedicated police officers have acted on those concerns. a handful of problems.
I mean, that really is astonishing, the way she starts setting up that question. And I'm going to play the full clip now where you actually get Senator Vance's response to her. But it just shows you the attitude that these people have. Here's the full clip.
The incidents were limited to a handful of apartment complexes, and the mayor said our dedicated police officers have acted on those concerns. A handful of problems.
Only, Martha, do you hear yourself? Only a handful of apartment complexes in America were taken over by Venezuelan gangs, and Donald Trump is the problem and not Kamala Harris's open border? Americans are so fed up with what's going on, and they have every right to be. And I really find this exchange, Martha, sort of interesting because you seem to be more focused with nitpicking everything that Donald Trump has said rather than acknowledging that apartment complexes in the United States of America are being taken over by violent gangs. I worry so much more about that problem than anything else here. We've got to get American communities in a safe space again. And unfortunately, when you let people in by the millions, most of whom are unvetted, most of whom you don't know who they really are, you're going to have problems like this. Kamala Harris, 94 executive orders that undid Donald Trump's successful border policies. We knew this stuff would happen. They bragged about opening the border, and now we have the consequences, and we're living with it. We can do so much better, but frankly, we're not going to do better, Martha, unless Donald Trump calls this stuff out. I'm glad that he did.
The goal of these people, by saying that the incidents were limited to just a few apartment complexes, so it's not a real big deal, that it's not something that people should even pay attention to. Just a few, as if the fact that crime is contained within a small number of apartment complexes, somehow it makes it less significant and less concerning. I mean, this is the heart of the elitist let them eat cake attitude, because these problems aren't happening in their neighborhoods. They don't see them as problems at all. For Martha Raddatz and the other elites in the circles, it's easy to brush this aside. It's easy to brush aside the fear, the anxiety, the disruption that the residents of only a few apartment complexes are experiencing. They don't have to live with the threat of violence or see their communities deteriorating. To them, it's a distant issue. It's something that you minimize and dismiss because it doesn't fit their narrative. But we should be crystal clear, whether it's one apartment complex or 100 apartment complexes is irrelevant. These are people's lives that we're talking about. These are Americans. These are legal permanent residents. For Raddatz to reduce the issue to just a few apartment complexes shows an astounding lack of empathy and awareness as to what's going on. And it's easy to make these kinds of dismissive comments when you're sitting comfortably in a nice studio and living in a secure, affluent neighborhood. It's easy to call the concerns over illegal immigration fear-mongering when your community isn't the one that's being destabilized, when you're not the one that's suffering from the results of the disastrous Biden policies. And this is the disconnect that lies between the elites and ordinary Americans. Raddatz and others like her, they're not worried about the impact of illegal immigration because it doesn't touch their lives. They don't live in Aurora, Colorado. They aren't dealing with the crime. They aren't dealing with the uncertainty, the fear that so many ordinary people face every single day. Instead, they downplay the problem and label anyone who dares to raise legitimate concerns as paranoid, racist, and xenophobic. And while Aurora may be an extreme example, it isn't unique to Aurora. Across the country, we're seeing stories of violence, murder, increased gang activity, prostitution, theft rings, and it's ordinary Americans, it's legal permanent residents, it's even illegal immigrants themselves that have to grapple with these consequences. Okay, because they're victims of these gangs too. It's not like these gangs leave illegal immigrants alone. In fact, they rob them, they abuse them, they beat them. But remember, if you question it, well, you're pushing misinformation. And it's because it doesn't affect them personally. That's why, when Ron DeSantis sent the plane full of migrants to Martha's Vineyard, it was a political stunt. I admitted it at the time. But the problem was that he let go. He let the political stunt happen and he didn't follow up, where he should have done it every single day to expose the frauds that these people really are. You had, 40-something people taken to Martha's Vineyard, and within less than 48 hours, the National Guard was called in to remove these individuals. Because, God forbid, the elite community share some of the burden that everyone else, that real Americans, ordinary Americans are facing. Imagine that. They don't understand, and frankly, they don't care. And that's why so many Americans are frustrated, because they see that people like Martha Raddatz, people like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and Democrats, they just brush off ordinary people's concerns as if they're insignificant. They downplay your grievances. And that's what led to the rise of someone like Trump. Remember, he was the only person who campaigned on this issue in 2016, and a lot of Americans gravitated to him for this very reason. And it doesn't mean that we're demonizing an entire group of people. It doesn't mean that every illegal immigrant that we feel is a criminal. That's not what it means at all. What it means is that we matter. The American people matter. And that our public servants are there to serve the public. The fact is, no apartment complex should be taken over by any gangs, whether they're American gangs, whether they're foreign gangs, any gangs. But it makes it even worse when it's people that have come to this country illegally, when it's people that are receiving government money, when they are receiving health care from the government, when the government's paying their hotel stays. It matters. Now, we're going to take a quick break, but when we get back, I'm going to wrap things up. So make sure you stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So we have to ask the question, why can't the elites understand why millions of Americans are getting frustrated, why millions of Americans are becoming angry, why millions of Americans have these grievances, why millions of Americans support someone like Donald Trump? You go back 20 years ago, someone like Donald Trump would have never made it into the primary cycle. Yet he ended up becoming president, and he may very well become president again. So instead of trying to understand why Americans support someone like Trump, and instead of trying to understand what led to the rise of someone like Trump, they just sit there and berate ordinary Americans. Now, the answer is simple, and it's because they're so out of touch with reality and the world that everyday Americans live in. Their let-them-eat-cake attitude blinds them to the frustrations and legitimate concerns that people have. And people see the America they know slipping away. And that blindness is key to understanding Trump's rise, right? For years, the elites have failed the American people on issue after issue after issue, whether it's the open border policies that have wreaked havoc in every state, the rampant inflation that's crushing family budgets. They don't get it. They live in a bubble, completely insulated from the problems the rest of us face. And when someone like Trump comes along, a billionaire, a guy that's a billionaire, and he speaks directly to the frustrations of ordinary people, the elites are like baffled. They're morons. They can't comprehend why people are drawn to him. And it's because they have no idea what real hardship looks like. Instead, they try and denigrate those that are drawn to him, that they're too stupid, they're ignorant, that they don't understand that Trump is a fascist dictator. And it's not to say that Trump is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. He may be better than some, but he is just a man. He is another politician. We need to keep that in mind. But he is in touch with the concerns of millions of ordinary Americans. But to the elites, it's incomprehensible. How could anyone possibly vote for this brute? How could anyone possibly vote for this Neanderthal, they wonder? And at the core of this disconnect is the sheer hypocrisy of the elite class. Everything they say, everything they do is nothing more than projection. Just the other day, they accused the former president, referring to his opposition as the enemy from within. And when he said that, the press and the Democrats, they went apoplectic like they usually do. They said he's going to target his political opposition. He's going to silence dissent and criticism. He's going to censor anyone who disagrees with him. Now, did I miss something here? Because isn't that exactly what the Democrats and the bureaucracy has been doing for the last decade? I mean, I do believe I released several episodes regarding this topic. And not for nothing, I'm not a fan of the type of rhetoric when we use the enemy from within or anything like that. I never liked that the press is the enemy of the people. I don't like that rhetoric. I don't think that rhetoric's helpful. However, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. These same people were silent when Pelosi publicly called Republicans the enemies of the state and domestic enemies on CNN or MSNBC in August of 2020. They have amnesia and forget that Pelosi referred to Republicans in Congress as the enemies from within. Or what about President Biden's deranged MAGA speech where he declared nearly half the country as domestic enemies and the biggest threat our republic has ever faced? And I could go on and on with a long list of Democrats that refer to Republicans as domestic terrorists, clingers, racist, white supremacists, radical extremists, deplorables. There are a long list of Democrats that have used words like purge and re-educate and deprogram when referring to anyone who doesn't think like them. And so while I may not like the rhetoric of the enemies of the people and stuff like that, there is little doubt that the bureaucracy has become thoroughly corrupt. On this podcast, I have provided evidence on numerous episodes of how the bureaucracy has been ideologically weaponized and how it targets dissent. Now, Trump's rise is a direct response to the elite's failures. For years, they've dismissed, ignored, and outright mocked the concerns of ordinary Americans. They've doubled down on the policies that actually hurt ordinary Americans and their families. And now they wonder why millions of people are gravitating towards someone who is willing to call them out, someone who is willing to disrupt the system and speak to the issues that they care about. And it's not that Trump supporters are blind to his flaws. They aren't. They see those flaws every single day. But for many, what Trump represents, he's the first political figure in a long time who seems to understand the frustration and the anger people feel. He's seen as someone who actually is authentic, someone who will fight back against the system, against the politicians, against the media, against the corrupt establishment, against the corporations that have sold out the American people time and time again. And the elites can't wrap that around their heads. They don't understand that, because they never take the time to speak to the peasant class. Instead, they just judge and demean them. They never fully understand because they don't move outside their bubbles. And they've never been on the receiving end of their own policies. They've never had to live with the consequences of the decisions that are made in places like Washington, D.C. or New York City. They've never had to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table. They are insulated, and that's why they're so out of touch. And Trump's appeal is partly personality, it's partly policy. It's about people finally feeling like someone is hearing them, like someone is speaking for them after years of being ignored, after years of being marginalized. And unless the elites can wake up and recognize the legitimate concerns that have led to Trump's rise, they're going to keep on missing the point, but more importantly, we're going to continue down a dangerous trajectory. So when they mock Trump and call his supporters deplorable, what they're really doing is doubling down on their elitist attitudes. And that's why no matter how hard they try, they will never be able to figure out why so many people can't stand them and why so many would actually go and pull the lever for someone like Trump. It's a cultural divide. And the elites are on one side looking down at the rest of the country, and they don't understand that Trump represents pushback. A pushback against a bureaucracy that's failed too many Americans. And until they recognize that, they will continue to look down on so many ordinary Americans. They will continue to ignore it, and the problem just gets worse. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please give the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating. Make sure to take 30 seconds, write a good review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and share this episode with your family and friends. Share it on social media. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back next week with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.